a nuclear capable system. And that's what made it so dangerous. And, it could be used to participate in a first strike. There was actually a plan in place to use the Persian II to decapitate. It's Moscow and it's it. Putin collapses, folds like a house of cards. It's over. He's out of here. It's done. No, the world ends. But there's that aspect of it too. But this ties into something else that's even more dangerous. There is a feeling that Russia is bluffing. The reality dictates he'll have to resign and hold snap elections for the presidency, and he'll be gone. And when he's gone, he will be replaced by somebody who will not pursue, irresponsible fringe policies. Keir Starmer is likewise history. They have, I think, concluded a contract. They've done their operational testing. A Tomahawk has been fired from a Dutch frigate. You would need to take out that facility effectively. You would need over 60 Tomahawk missiles to strike that facility. It isn't going to be done with one or two. You would need 60.
Well, the talk is there's three variants of it that were made. There's an air-launched variant, there's a sea-launched variant, and then there's a ground-launched variant. The ground-launched variant was deployed to Europe back in the early 1980 seconds as part of the counterforce strategy taken by the United States to offset the Soviet deployment of the SS-20 intermediate range nuclear missile road mobile. The SS-20 was seen as changing the balance of power in Europe, giving the Soviets tremendous amount of advantage, and we needed to counter it. So we deployed two systems: the Persian II, which is a solid rocket missile, very capable, very accurate, and we also deployed the ground-launched cruise missile, the Tomach. The Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty was signed because what the world recognized is that these weapon systems of intermediate range were extraordinarily destabilizing, especially when deployed in Europe. And if you wanted to have a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union, then these were the perfect weapons to deploy, because the instability regime created would inevitably spin out of control. So President Reagan and General Secretary Gorbachev wisely in December of 1987 signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. It went into force in July of 1988, and we got rid of them, eliminated them. The air-launched variant was still there. I know it very well. During the Gulf War, 1991, the first combat use of the air-launched cruise missile was used to strike initially the Taji Iraqi missile production facility. And there was the sea-launched version, which everybody has seen fired from ships and come out of the water from submarines. And it, again, played a very important role in the early moments of Desert Storm and just about every American military operation since. But the ground-launched version was gone, eliminated until Donald Trump decided that he was going to pull out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which he did in August of 2019, citing a manufactured case. At least that's my assessment. The case that we made against the Russians, that they were, fielding a system, the 9M729, we claimed to have intermediate range in excess of 500 miles. And, the Russians denied it, did their best to try and prove otherwise, but we pulled out because we wanted to pull out. And the reason why I went to pull out is we wanted to deploy the Tomahawk in a ground launch. Within weeks of pulling out, we did the first test of the ground launch Tomahawk, fired from what's called a Mark 41 pod at a shore, the same system that's used on ships and also used, by the way, in Poland and in Romania as part of their so-called ballistic missile defense shield. Can also launch missiles like the Tomahawk that are ground attack missiles. And so here we are. It's back in system. It is not, I mean, there is a nuclear variant. Obviously, we're not providing that to anybody except maybe the British. But even then, I don't think so. But the Tomahawk's best known for its conventional payload, its ability to, strike accurately over long distances. But it's a hyped up system. I'll just be honest with you. There are certain things that I'm allowed to talk about and certain things I'm not allowed to talk about. One of the things I'm still not allowed to talk about is the accuracy of the Tomahawk during Desert Storm. You can put two and two together as to maybe why they wouldn't want to talk about the specific effectiveness of that system. But we have even though they've improved the Tomahawk over time in terms of, improved guidance, taking advantage of new technologies, when the Tomahawk was used against Syria and again by Donald Trump and another hyped up thing, it didn't perform well. The majority of them were shot down or missed their targets. The Tomahawk's just not a very good system, and you need a lot of Tomahawks to destroy a facility. Again, I mentioned the Taji missile facility north of Baghdad for a reason, because we blanketed it with Tomahawks, scores of them, and we never fully destroyed it. So it's a system that has some capability, but when it comes to actual physical destruction of facilities, it's just not that. We fired 35 of them, most recently against Iran, I believe, targeting missile sites in Isfahan, or nuclear sites in Isfahan, with little or no effect. So here's that system that it's now up for export. The United States, always looking to make a penny, has decided that it wants to export the Tomahawk. Before, I think ourselves and the British were the only ones who've used it. Now, the talk is to send it to Japan and the Netherlands is the important party here because, as you indicated, the Darmok wouldn't be provided directly by the United States to Ukraine. It would be sent through a European intermediary, through a NATO country. And the Dutch have, they have, I think, concluded a contract. They've done their operational testing. A ton has been fired from a Dutch frigate, and the Dutch are in line to buy a couple hundred of these things, delivery expected to begin in 2028. And so when we talk about providing the Tomahawk to Ukraine, it would be through a European intermediary, and the Dutch seem to be the most likely candidates because they're the only European power besides the British to be purchasing the Tomahawk. Any other European nation coming up, you'd have to get in line, and your Korean would never see that weapon system. But this is where we're at. It's it can reach out and touch people 1,500 miles. Accurately. But as President Putin mentioned in Valdai, the very discussion group you were at, it's an old system and they can shoot it down and it's not a game changer. It really isn't a game changer unless it strikes political targets. I mean, as a weapon system to degrade. The only reason why Ukraine would want this is to, for instance, you see a lot of talk now about using the Tomahawk or Tomahawk-like system to take out the drone production facility near Kazan. You would need to take out that facility effectively. You would need over 60 Tomahawk missiles to strike that facility. It isn't going to be done with one or two. You would need 60, and even then, there's no guarantee to strike other facilities. For instance, if you want to take out the Vodkin's missile assembly plant where the Russians are pumping out the scanned S's, they're pumping out the Archnik, they're pumping out other systems, strategic as well, you would probably have to strike that facility with well over 100 Tomahawks. And even then, there's no guarantee of success. It's just not that effective of a system. Glenn, with all due respect, we've crossed that line already. We are at war with Russia. We just don't acknowledge it. But it's war. The Russians know this. They've made statements to that effect. And even Marco Rubio says, we are in a proxy war with Russia. That's a war. We are direct participants in this conflict, and we have been for some time now. The Tomahawk, however, would be literally a bridge too far. First of all, it's a nuclear-capable system. The deterrent factor that it had back in the 1,980 seconds wasn't because it delivered a conventional payload. It's because it delivered a nuclear payload during the Cold War. When the Tomahawk was first deployed to Europe in a ground launch version, it was a nuclear-capable system, and that's what made it so dangerous. And it could be used to participate in a first strike. There was actually a plan in place to use the Persian II to decapitate Soviet leadership, U command and control. And then the Tomahawk, combined with Trident missiles launched from Ohio-class submarines operating close to shore on a reduced trajectory, would seek to destroy as much of the Soviet, nuclear missiles as possible to create inevitability of defeat. Classic first strike. This is what made it so destabilizing, and that's why the decision was made to get rid of them. But now when you have to ask yourself, if you're a Russian and you see a Tomahawk being fired at you from Ukraine or from anywhere, how do you know it's not nuclear? How do you know it's not part of this decapitation? If you go back to December of 2021, when the Russians were talking to the Biden administration about Ukraine, the Russians made it clear over and over again that the one thing that they worried about more than anything else was NATO long-range missiles based on Ukrainian soil. You see, Ukraine is like a fist in the Russian womb. All the Russian strategic infrastructure was designed during Soviet times and placed during Soviet times when Ukraine is part of the Soviet Union, and so where the Russian facilities are and capabilities our bases are was considered to be part of a strategic depth. It would take some effort to get from NATO countries through the Warsaw Pact into the Soviet depth. Because remember, it wasn't just Ukraine, but you had the whole buffering states of Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Wester, East Germany. They all provided a buffer too in terms of space. And now, NATO expansion has brought NATO right up to the Russian borders. And now with Ukraine, you just come in and literally all of the Russian strategic depth is now exposed. And the Russians said, we can't allow you to NATO to put long-range strike capabilities in there. And the Biden administration would not commit to not doing this. So literally, the Tomahawk is the Russian nightmare coming true. And the Russian nuclear doctrine is quite specific that if a non-nuclear state is empowered by a nuclear state to strike Russia, then Russia were treated as an attack by a nuclear state and respond with the full capacity of its capabilities, which is nuclear. And so we need to acknowledge right up from the start that any use by Ukraine of Tomahawk missiles would bring about a possible Russian nuclear response, especially if they struck political targets. Could you imagine a Tomahawk missile hitting the Kremlin, hitting Street Basil, hitting the Bolshoi Theater, hitting Street Petersburg? Imagine what would happen if the Russians provided caliber missiles to Venezuela, and then the Venezuelans fired them, and they struck the Capitol, they struck the White House, they struck the Smithsonian. You think the United States would go, oh, well, it's just war? Or would we not only eliminate Venezuela forever, but probably eliminate the Russians as well for facilitating this attack? Because I would imagine that the caliber missile could not be fired without assistance, targeting assistance, technical assistance from Russian technicians. The question now is, can that Tomahawk be operated by Ukraine, without assistance? The version of the Tomahawk that the United States employs that has access to satellites, GPS satellites, radar satellites, imaging satellites, that provides real-time updates. This cannot be operated by anybody other than Americans. Because first of all, the communication systems are all heavily encrypted, and the key material is closely guarded, secret protected by the National Security Agency and other defense security agencies, and it will not be shared with anybody. These are the most closely held secrets in the United States. And the other thing is the packaging. For instance, the terrain following technology, that strike package, the mapping is prepared by a special American Department of Defense activity that uses American intelligence information to do this. And nobody else in the world can replicate that. So if you're using TEROM, that means you're using American intelligence specifically configured for the target that you're striking, which means America is now targeting Russia in effect. The same thing with the GPS. It's military-grade GPS, which is an encrypted communications. If you used commercial-grade GPS, the Russians would jam it. The missile would be stupid. And then finally, the final guidance that goes in is, imaging matching. Images are stored inside the Tomahawk, and then as it comes in, it scans and it's looking for a match, and it finds the match and then does the final maneuver to hit the target. That's again imagery provided by the United States system. Again, that cannot operate without the United States. So the American version of the Tomahawk could not be provided to Ukraine without the Americans running the whole show body. Maybe a Ukrainian finger would push the launch button, but everything else would be the United States. It would be the United States literally attacking Russia. The export version, by necessity, would have to be dumbed down. To what extent it would be dumbed down, I don't know. Nobody's come out and said that. I do know that Congress has provided waivers for the missile technology control regime so that the Tomahawk could be exported. And one would imagine that there would be a degradation of capabilities that the United States, in selling the weapons system to another nation, even a NATO nation, would have to configure it so that it could be controlled by just that NATO nation. And then the question is that transferable to Ukraine? Meaning that if you can dumb it down for the Dutch, can the Dutch just transfer to the Ukrainians and give the Ukrainians a similar level of dumbed down training that they had? These things aren't known yet, but it doesn't matter, because the moment a Tomahawk is launched against Russia, the Russians have no choice but to assume that it's a nuclear-capable missile and will have to act accordingly. Well, there's two things. One is desperation. We're losing bad. We gambled everything on the belief that the Russians wouldn't be able to survive sanctions. The Russians wouldn't be able to survive diplomatic isolation, and that the Russians didn't have the military capacity to sustain this conflict. we were hoping that the Russians would collapse, literally collapse. And the whole purpose of this campaign was to bring about economic collapse that would bring about societal collapse, that would bring about political collapse. This is a regime change operation that's being run part and parcel of a policy that's been in place since Vladimir Putin was won his first election. I mean, there was a period of time between Yeltsin appointing him on New Year's Eve 1999 and Putin winning the election in March of 2000, where, you know, we believe that he was just a figurehead, placeholder, that we could manipulate the Russian political system as we had previously with Boris Yeltsin and put somebody in that would be more to our liking. But when Putin won the election, very narrowly, by the way, people can't think he's a dictator. He's a democratically elected guy, won by a very narrow margin. We didn't know what to do. And so we began a policy of containment. How do we contain? Because, see, we had Russia where we wanted them down with our foot on their throat. How do we continue this with a guy that we didn't pick? And so we've been struggling with Putin ever since then. And, the Obama administration, straight up the Russian reset, you remember that famous red button that Hillary Clinton pushed and giggling with, Sergei Lavrov was a regime change operation. The whole purpose of the reset was to keep Vladimir Putin out and keep Dmitry Viet. That was it. That's the only reason why it happened. And when it failed, when Putin came back, we doubled down, nim sub noni, all the CIA operations, 100% straight up CIA operations designed to undermine, the Russian political system, to create an opposition, not because we believed in democracy, but because we wanted to bring down Vladimir Putin. And we've been, embarked on this ever since. And the special military operation was, basically the Russians saying no to a whole bunch of stuff. But so this is a regime change operation, and it has failed. Vladimir Putin today is stronger than he has ever been. I mean, anybody thought that this man would wilt. You saw him 4 hours. The brain works. The brain is attached to 25 years of experience of rebuilding Russia, of leading Russia out of the ashes to this position of global prominence. This is the last place the people who were gunning for Putin wanted him to be. And so there is a sense of desperation that they have failed in the architecture that was supposed to facilitate the demise of Russia, NATO, the European Union, the rules-based international order, the G7, the G20. It's all falling apart. And the United States is recognizing that its role is, unmatched global hegemon is over. We are transitioning, whether we like it or not, to a multipolar system where Russia is playing a major role. And we always feared what would happen if Russia and China got together. Well, Russia and China have sort of gotten together. And so we're gambling that we can still bring Putin down, and that, you see this, Gilbert Doctorow, I know you know him. He has talked about a coup Russian elites being, this is just nonsense. This is Western fantasy land. There is no coup being plotted. There are no disenchanted elites plotting against Vladimir Putin. This is just an absurdity extreme. But it's this kind of thinking that empowers the Keith Kellogg's and the Marco Rubio's and the Pete Hecht's and the other Russophobes who surround Donald Trump, because they need to believe that there's a chance for victory. They can't accept the inevitability of Russia's, Vladimir Putin, walking away a victor in this. And so they are convincing themselves that by taking these actions, they will bring down Russia. I mean, Dr. Omaha hits Moscow and Putin collapses, folds like a house of cards. It's over. He's out of here. It's done. No, the world ends. So there's that aspect of it too. But this ties into something else that's even more dangerous. There is a feeling that Russia is bluffing, that Russia is basically holding a pair of twos and betting like they're holding the royal flesh, that when it comes time to call the hand, Russia is not going to be holding the cards and will have to fold. That they're overplaying this. And a large part of the reason why people believe this is because of the maturity of Vladimir Putin and not overreacting to all the provocations and the reticence of Russia to escalate unnecessarily. Russia, has taken insults and hits that would prompt Western nations to react in a different manner. But Russia instead has absorbed this, much to the frustration of many people in the West who are like, why is Russia taking this? Why is Putin not? Because they're winning. The bottom line is they're winning across the board. Russia's not losing any aspect of this confrontation, this proxy war with the West. They're winning every aspect of it. And Putin's confidence in his 4-hour presentation at Valdai certifies this, that, he is a man who is confident of where Russia is and where Russia's going, and he's confident of Russia's capabilities. But people inside the Trump administration believe that he's bluffing, that all we have to do is call his bluff. And so that's why they're pushing for this. They're crossing red lines that any rational player would never cross. One of the reasons why they do this is that they have been infected with Russophobia. And Russophobia literally deadens the brain about the reality of Russia. Russophobia prevents you from having a realistic assessment of Russia. The CIA is thoroughly infected with Russophobia. You saw this in 2016 with the nonsense of Russiagate and how the CIA orchestrated this, deliberately manufacturing or exaggerating or misrepresenting intelligence for political purposes because they believe in their heart of hearts that Vladimir Putin was an evil, dictatorial autocrat who had to be removed for the good of the world. And two, that the Russians couldn't back up their posturing, that if we just pushed the Russians, they would collapse. And so here we are with the CIA advising the president that Russia's weak. He's surrounded by people who are saying the Russians are bluffing. And most importantly, the president's embarrassed. You see, he put a lot of political capital in bringing this Ukrainian-Russian conflict to an end. He said he could do it. He implied that all he had to do is pick up a phone and the world would come to him. And now he's embarrassed. He's got mud on his face and embarrassed. He's looking for face-saving ways out of this. And he's surrounded by people who are saying, peace through strength, Mr. President, peace through strength. You must be strong. And the Russians are bluffing. Putin's not as strong as he thinks he is. He's taking more casualties than he's admitting. They're not capable of producing what they produce. They are an oil-based economy. All we have to do is strangle their oil, and they will collapse like a house of cards. And he's getting all of this Russophobic advice, and nobody who knows anything about Russia's in his orbit. I mean, Steve Witko has, a window into the reality of Russia through Kirill Dmitriev and his occasional meetings with Vladimir Putin. But Witko's not a good conduit because Witko can't translate Russian reality into effective advice for Donald Trump. Witkoff is simply a tool used by Donald Trump to send messages to Russia, but he's not a very good conduit for receiving messages and accurately portraying the Russian reality. And so we have a president who literally lives in La La Land right now, who is agreeing to things because he believes that it's effective policy, and he believes that Russia is weaker than it is, and he believes that Russia's bluffing